Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyke, the CEO of Urban Green. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live Q&A in just a bit, as Caitlin mentioned. Today, we're going to take a look at the vital transportation infrastructure for New York City, and that's the MTA. The MTA plays such a huge role in reopening New York City, and it plays an even larger role in our low carbon future. Last year, the New York City subway system alone saw 1.7 billion rides. Now, that's a very carbon efficient way to move people around, and it explains why transportation in New York City accounts for just 30% of carbon emissions compared to buildings at 70%. So my guest today is the leader of that system, Pat Foye, Chairman and CEO of the MTA. Pat, welcome to Urban Green Live.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
It's such a busy time at the MTA, and we really thank you for spending a few minutes with us and our audience today. Pat, everyone wants to know how the MTA is approaching the coronavirus and the MTA's role in safely reopening New York City. So let's start there. What safety measures have been put in place, and what type of different experience can riders expect, whether they're taking public transportation, whether it's trains, subways, or buses through the MTA?
So, John, the first COVID-19 case in New York was reported on March 1st or 2nd. The next day, we started disinfecting, not cleaning. Disinfecting subway stations, subway cars, Metro North and Long Island Railroad stations and cars, buses, and accessorized vehicles. And we have continued that. We've actually pioneered a number of new cleaning and disinfecting techniques I'll talk about at some point this morning. And we have ramped up that disinfecting process. So every subway station, every subway car is being disinfected multiple times a day. Same thing with respect to Long Island Railroad and Metro North stations and cars, buses as well. It is state law right now as a result of Governor Cuomo's executive order that on public transit, passengers and employees have to wear masks. That has the force of state law. Public health officials are, I think, united in the belief that masks are the single most important thing that our customers can do to protect their health, to minimize health risks to themselves, their fellow commuters, and our employees. I was out on a mask force on Thursday, not task force, that's mask force. And I, with some of my colleagues, rode the 7 from 74th Street and Roosevelt Avenue in Jackson Heights, which is my old subway station, just coincidentally, grew up in Jackson Heights. Took it out to Flushing, took the 7 back to 74th Street. We got on the E, got off at 53rd and Lex, got on the 6, and then took the 4 or 5, I don't remember which, back to Broadway, which is where the MTA is headquartered. And we gave out probably hundreds of masks. We saw, I would say, well over 1,000 customers, and sorry, in 2 bus lines in Queens, I ought to mention. We saw well over 1,000 customers, and I think there were 4 who didn't have a mask on. That is backed up by data that we have on subway customers and bus customers, physical counts of customers. And mask compliance on the subways is over 90% and also 90% on buses. And we're beginning to do similar counts on the Long Island Railroad and Metro North. I ride the Long Island Railroad every day, and it seems to me, anecdotal, because I don't ride every train or every line, but mask compliance on the Long Island Railroad and at Penn Station is very high. Clearly the single most important thing that we can do. We've distributed 3 million masks to subway and bus customers, thanks to masks provided by the state of New York and the city of New York. We've provided about 5 million masks to our employees since the pandemic started, over 7 million pairs of gloves, and over 50,000 gallons of hand sanitizer. We've had sufficient supplies of personal protective equipment pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and as far ahead as we can see in terms of inventory on hand and orders from reputable providers going forward. We are, in terms of innovation, we have been piloting on subways and buses the use of ultraviolet C light with Dr. David Brenner, who's an expert on ultraviolet light at the Irving Medical Center, a part of Columbia University. And we've piloted ultraviolet C light, and with Dr. Brenner, announced the first determination that ultraviolet C light eradicates the COVID-19 virus, which is very good news. We're in the process now of doing a pilot on far UV light on subways and buses, again with Dr. Brenner, and are also looking at, and have been since March, looking at antimicrobials, which, if they prove out, and they're being reviewed in independent laboratories around the world, as well as government agencies in the United States, if it proves out, may have the ability to eradicate the COVID-19 virus, and to do so for a period of weeks and months after initial application, if applied with electrostatic applicators. We are also looking at the air exchange issue. And throughout, our entire program's been driven by one. We're transportation people. We're not public health officials or epidemiologists. So we've relied on the best advice from public health officials, including Dr. Zucker, the New York State Health Commissioner, CDC, et cetera. And two, we have looked at our counterpart agencies around the country and around the world. And thirdly, we have ramped up the disinfecting regimes as the pandemic has continued. New York City and New York State are in a good place right now, and as a result of the governor's leadership on stopping the spread of the virus. And we are dedicated to doing everything we can. The last point I'd make, John, before returning it back over to you, is we have looked at the experience in Tokyo and Seoul and Vienna and other parts of the world, and the experience certainly seems to me that obviously Asia and Europe entered the pandemic before North America and came out of it before. And on those systems where there's been significant increases in ridership from the depths of their pandemic situation in Asia and Europe, ridership has increased significantly, as it has in New York from the depths of the pandemic, and there has been no surge in COVID-19 cases in those communities where the public transit agencies are, who've experienced that increase in ridership attributable to mass transit. I think that's largely due to disinfecting regime, and again, mask.
So that's an incredible amount of work that you're doing, and part of it is closing the subways at 1 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the morning to do that. Can you get through every car, and how long do you see that practice having to keep going?
You're right. We did make this tough decision a couple of months ago to close the system at 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Obviously, given the decline in ridership, relatively small number by MTA, New York standards of customers inconvenienced, we substituted robust bus service and for-hire vehicles for those who'd have unduly long commutes. The closure enables us to disinfect every subway station and every car multiple times a day. We're doing that disinfecting as a result of the closure at terminal stations when the station closes at 1 o'clock, and everybody except MTA employees or police or social workers have to leave the system, and that's played a really important role in us being able to do that level of disinfecting on the subways.
And so, how should people assess risk when deciding to use public transportation or not? Like, from the moment they step into a subway station, what do you want them to be thinking about for how they can not only protect themselves, but how they can protect everybody else around them and the MTA workers as well?
Well, look, I think what we want our customers and our employees to know is that every step has been taken to minimize public health risk to employees and customers. And that includes the disinfecting. It includes the governor's directive that masks have to be worn on public transit by by everybody, and I reported the mass compliance data on subways and buses, and that's that's really important. And I think the pioneering innovative work we've done with the MTA's Chief Innovation Officer, Mark Dowd, on the ultraviolet C light, the FAR UV, the antimicrobials, the air exchange issue, I think are all part of that. And I think when customers get on a subway car, we've surveyed customers and 70% of them have reported that they've never seen subway stations and subway cars be as clean as they are. And I think empirically that's the case. So it's a question of being able to assure our customers we're doing everything we can to minimize public health risk, but also for the stations and the subway cars to speak for themselves. And also the smell of a newly disinfected subway station or subway car kind of speaks for itself. The mask force that I described is part of it. I think we've touched most of the subway lines and many of the bus lines, and we're continuing to do the mask force work and continuing to communicate robustly. And the results are demonstrated by the mask compliance data on the subways and buses and the 70% approval of our customers in terms of stations and rolling stock.
So I think on a normal day, there's about 5.5 million riders on the New York City subways. What was the lowest point, and how much have you bounced back so far?
So right now we are at about 1.2 million passengers on subways. So, that's, depending on the day, 21, 22, 23%, depending on the day of pre-pandemic average weekday. On buses, we're at about 50% of pre-pandemic levels, and I'll kind of suggest a couple of reasons for that. Average pre-pandemic weekday, 5.5 million customers on subways, 2.1 million on buses. For a good period of the pandemic, bus ridership had eclipsed subway ridership, very unusual. The bars on the chart, lines on the chart changed about 14 days ago, a couple of weeks ago, where subways are now carrying more passengers than buses. Part of the reason for that, I think, is some customers get comfort out of being able to look out the window and see. Be at the ground level. Also, one of the protective processes we put in place was rear door boarding on our local buses, and to minimize contact between bus operators and customers. One consequence of that was local customers on local bus lines did not have to pay, because there's on buses currently no way to pay in the back, and we did it to protect bus operators. That'll change next month. We're putting in protective plexiglass devices that will protect the bus operator, allow him or her to have unimpeded access to mirrors for safety reasons, but also allow customers to pay as they board up front. It'll be interesting to see what effect that change has on subway and bus ridership. One of the consequences of that, John, obviously, is we get about half our revenue from our customers in terms of fares and tolls on MTA bridges and tunnels. That's about half of our revenue, half of $17 billion. And the remainder, the other half roughly, comes from a dedicated to the MTA package of taxes and subsidies that the state legislatures put in place over the past period of decades. Both of those have declined precipitously during the pandemic, and 5.5 million customers on subways, for instance, and now are carrying 1.2 million and have been carrying passenger levels in the hundreds of thousands at the depths of the pandemic, when we and the governor and Governor Cuomo were urging everybody to stay home except for essential workers and first responders. Obviously, as New York City and the rest of the state, the downstate region especially, have come out of the New York on pause, and New York City, having entered phase 4, as did Long Island and Westchester and North. Ridership has increased, but it is still a fraction of what it was pre-pandemic. That's had a dramatic impact on our finances. And just a word about the finances. So the Congress and the president signed into law, say 3 months ago, the CARES Act, which provided stimulus funding, including money for public transit agencies. The MTA got $3.9 billion, and we're incredibly grateful and appreciative of that, to offset the decline in revenues and also some increased expenses as a result of the disinfecting program that I described a couple of minutes ago. We officially exhausted the last of that funding last Friday. Friday the 24th, I guess it was. And we are hoping to be included, and the New York congressional delegation supports this, as does Senator Schumer. And obviously the United States Senate has come back in session yesterday, Monday, July 27th. And we're hopeful that another COVID-19 bill will be passed, and that it will include $3.9 billion of funding for the MTA. Senator Schumer, minority leader of the United States Senate, incredibly supportive of the MTA historically and with respect to the CARES Act and this next round of funding. Amazingly, what the $3.9 billion that we previously received and the 3.94 that we hope for now is to cover our revenue declines over 2020. We hired McKinsey some number of months ago to review the revenue decline, and their estimates have been right on target. But we're expecting a continuing deficit in 2021 of about $6.5, $6.6 billion, which are staggering numbers in 2020 and 2021. And the point being, we are going to need additional support, financial support from the federal government going forward because of the huge, dramatic, precipitous decline in our revenues, both fare and tolls from customers and from the package of taxes and subsidies that was put in place to fund the MTA's operations.
So I want to transition to sustainability next, Pat, because I know the huge role MTA can play there. But before I do that, maybe just one last question here, and I'm sure the audience will have more, is maybe
Sure.
I'll leave it with, what was your biggest surprise or the MTA's biggest lesson learned so far from COVID-19?
Well, look, I think everyone was shocked by the New York was the epicenter of the pandemic, and in the United States for a long time. That's no longer the case as a result of the governor's leadership. But the dramatic effect it's had on a 21st century nation, a 21st century society, a 21st century city, which is based on density. Public transit, mass transit is mass is the word before transit. And that has been a huge advantage of cities going back centuries, and in a relatively short period of time, density, which provides business innovation and financial innovation and cultural innovation and restaurant innovation and entertainment, etc., flipped, and density became a disadvantage from a public health point of view and from a public transit point of view. And that was a new experience. New York City last had a pandemic like this in 1918, 1919. And interestingly enough, one of the things that the state and the city did back in 1918 is something that we're all doing now again, which is we've been urging employers in New York City and the region to stagger work hours, work days, to minimize crowding in offices and elevators and on mass transit. That's something that the state and the city did 100 years ago. So I think the thing that was most surprising was density, which is one of the things that gives large, vibrant international cities like New York their vigor and vitality. Overnight became a became a disadvantage, and the financial and economic and social and mental health consequences of that, we are still all living that. And clearly the MTA is living with that from a financial point of view. I just gave you some brief insights into the financial picture, and it continues to be challenging. I described it at a board meeting last week as from an MTA point of view, once in 100 years fiscal tsunami that left our infrastructure intact and demolished 40% of our revenues. And that that's the reality we face.
So let's talk about sustainability for a little bit, Pat. The MTA, I mean, by definition, your mission is you keep cars off the road, and that lowers the overall carbon emissions for New York City. What are ways that MTA can lower its own emissions, though? You started with electric buses. Are there more plans for that? Are there opportunities in rail and subway to lower the carbon emissions of those systems? How do you think about those things?
Yeah, we are committed to that. As you noted at the beginning, John, the MTA, by moving 5.5 million customers on subways and 2.1 on buses every workday, diminishes significantly the number of cars on the road. We are focused on, for instance, our capital plan approved a year ago, $51.5 billion. Would have and hopefully will modernize the entire system. The capital plan covers the period 2020 to 2024 and really touches every MTA agency and every important feature of the MTA agencies would have provided, for instance, the largest electric bus order in the history of the United States. The capital plan, I ought to note, is on pause right now until we're able to determine the extent of federal funding and the impact that the pandemic is going to have on the ultimate execution of the capital plan. We are looking at regenerative braking on our subway cars and Metro North and Long Island Railroad cars. We are doing, for instance, solar at parking garages, and we'll be doing more of that. And we are committed to reducing further the amount of emissions from the system and the amount of emissions that we save every day of operations. The other thing I got to talk about is the $51.5 billion capital plan is intended to be funded by congestion pricing, which would be the first in the nation. So the capital plan was approved in 2019. The state budget, as a result of the governor's leadership, included the first in the nation congestion pricing. That was April of 2019. We've been meeting with US DOT since the middle of April of 2019. The congestion pricing is, just to give you a sense of its importance to the capital plan, it would provide $15 billion over a period of years of the $51 billion capital plan. So that's 30% of the capital plan. The US DOT has been holding up in Washington, has been holding up the processing of the congestion pricing plan for reasons that are, at least to me, inexplicable. There is an environmental process that applies, and I'll kind of point out the paradoxical kind of nature of the environmental process in a second. So, some streets in the central business district of Manhattan have received federal funding, so they're, quote, federalized as a result, and the federal government has an interest. The paradoxical and, to me, cynical thing about holding congestion pricing up is that congestion pricing first will fund the MTA, an environmental good, reduce congestion in Manhattan and the entirety of the city of New York, and for that matter, the region, improve air quality, et cetera, all significant environmental goods, and holding that up for an environmental process. And from our point of view, we're just asking for a decision. Tell us what environmental process you'd like us to pursue. Frankly, in an ideal world, there ought to be a categorical exclusion for congestion pricing in an environment like New York City. But in any event, we've not gotten that decision. We continue to to pursue it. And as I said, that's 30% of the funding for the capital plan.
What about resiliency? So climate resiliency, I mean, your network is maybe among the most at risk from climate threats and climate incursions. How do you think about resiliency, and are there items in your capital plan to help bolster the system from future threats?
There are, for instance, the number of the tunnels were flooded during Superstorm Sandy. We received significant funding from the federal government for Super Sandy recovery and resiliency. The last tunnel, the Rutgers Tunnel, that the F-train uses, we're beginning work on that. Every one of those, including, for instance, the Canarsie Tunnel, the L-train tunnel, which was done on time and early as a result of some innovation suggested by Jano Lieber and his team, and a team of led by a team of professors from Columbia and Cornell, led by the deans of Lance Collins and Mary Boyce from Cornell and Columbia engineering schools, respectively, provided an incredible value. On each of those projects, we are making them resilient, not only in accordance with the requirements of US DOT funders, but also to make sure you're quite right. Our system is, I'm looking out the window at 2 Broadway here where the MTA lives, and our system, Metro North, Long Island Railroad, subways, buses, is surrounded by water on every side, and we are focused on resiliency and making sure that we will survive the next once in a 100-year storm, although they seem to come a lot more frequently than 100 years in the past. But we're committed to resiliency and sustainability. And as you said, what the MTA is about is taking cars off the roads and getting people on mass transit, which is why the federal funding that I described before is so absolutely vital to the MTA and to New York.
Great. So for our audience, I have 2 more questions, and then we'll start teeing up the audience questions. So start logging them in, and Caitlin will be ready for those. Pat, what's the internal process for setting and tracking and measuring sustainability initiatives at MTA? How do you approach it holistically?
Well, look, we have sustainability goals. We've got a team working on these issues. I think it's fair to say that on sustainability issues, it's the core of the MTA as an organization, because we are, first subway lines were built in 1904, the Lexington Avenue line, which is 100 yards or 50 yards away from where I'm sitting right now. And the movement of people away from personal vehicles to mass transit has been what the MTA has been about since its predecessor started in 1904 in the Long Island Railroad, even before that. So we measure that. We do environmental and sustainability reports on a regular basis, and it is a core priority and something that we're proud of. And frankly, one of the reasons why, again, to go back to the federal funding piece, why the federal funding is so critical, because not only will failing to fund the MTA stunt and thwart the economic and job creating recovery of New York City and the New York City regional economy, but also our environmental and sustainability goals will also be thwarted if we're not able to get that federal funding and avoid some of the drastic things like delaying or deferring the capital plan that we'd be required to do if we don't get that funding.
Okay, great. So audience, get your questions ready. But Pat, my last question to you for this segment is, this program is about a zero carbon future. So Pat, how do you think we get there as a society?
Well, look, I think, John, I think mass transit is going to be a part of it. I think in New York City, congestion pricing has to be a part of it. The electric bus order that I mentioned in the 2020 to 24 capital plan, largest ever in the history of the United States. I think by the next capital plan, we will have made our last bus order for non-electric buses, and we'll be well in the process to shifting to a fully electric system. I think that getting more out of regenerative braking on subways and Metro North and Long Island Railroad all will be pieces of it. But the single most important thing that the MTA can do is to increase our capacity to carry New Yorkers to and from jobs, school, medical appointments, entertainment, et cetera. The more we can do that, and frankly, the more we can expand the system, and I'll talk about two expansion projects which are fundamental parts of the capital plan. One is extension of the 2nd Avenue subway from 96th Street up to 125th Street in Harlem. And it's not only a transportation priority and an environmental priority, it's also a social justice priority. The Harlem, East Harlem area in particular is one of the least served by mass transit in Manhattan and in New York City. And it is one of the regions of Manhattan and New York City which is most reliant on cars. Extending the 2nd Avenue subway, which is a key part of the 2020 capital plan, it achieves those job creation, transportation, and environmental goals. And equally, the Penn Station Access Project, which is also part of the 2020 capital plan, would allow Metro North for the first time to be able to, Metro North trains to be able to travel to and from Penn Station. But a key part of that would be the building of 4 new Metro North stations in the Bronx, Co-op City, Parkchester, et cetera, which would allow those residents of the Bronx to be able to shorten their commutes dramatically to both to Manhattan and to Westchester for job employment reasons, for medical reasons, Montefiore Medical Center, and able to access all sorts of educational opportunities both in the rest of New York City as well in Westchester. Those two projects, and obviously social equity component of the Penn Station access as well, are key components of the 2020 to 24 capital plan, and are at risk as the capital plan is on pause until we're able to determine the level of federal funding.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pat. Caitlin, let's open it up to audience questions.
Sounds good. Our first question is from Rick Fadrizi. Thank you for this important information and congratulations on the extensive measures you have taken in each station and subway car along with the trains and buses. I also want to commend you on the important consumer education that you're doing every day. My question is, what about the many MTA buildings that are likely house many hundreds of people? Have you put any measures in place to get the building folks back to work safely? Thanks again for all you're doing.
That's an excellent question. So the short answer is yes. So I mentioned I'm at 2 Broadway. In 2 Broadway, what we are doing, we've divided the workforce into the A-line team and the B-line team. Decided to name them after subway lines. What else would we do? And we've asked half the people to come in on certain days and the other half to come in. Obviously, a significant portion of our non-operating workforce has been working remotely during the pandemic, and that has gone, I think, surprisingly well. We're in the process of assessing the productivity in various parts of the agency from a telecommuting point of view. So we're taking our own advice and directives in terms of staggered hours, staggered days. We are monitoring the temperature of everybody who enters this building. During the pandemic, we created a temperature brigade, which took hundreds of thousands of temperature checks of transit workers, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, bus employees as well. In a small number of cases found that certain employees had fevers and they were directed to go home, quarantine, if appropriate, and put in touch with medical personnel. We're doing that at 2 Broadway and other facilities. We've got portals downstairs that check the temperature of everybody entering the building. And again, in a small number of cases, fevers have been detected. We've got decals in the elevators limiting elevator capacity and, directing our colleagues, where to stand on the elevator for maximum social distance. We've got floor markers indicating that you should enter the building through these set of escalators and exit through others. Hand sanitizer in the lobby for everybody who enters. Hand sanitizer on every floor. So we've been following the advice of public health officials, not only with respect to our customers, but with respect to our employees, both operating and those in administrative positions, and are doing everything we can to minimize health risks, not only for customers, but for employees as well.
Great. This next question is from Leonard. Can you please explain what regenerative braking is and how it lowers carbon emissions?
Sure. The principle of regenerative braking, and it's not a new practice, is to take the energy that are generated by the wheels on subway cars, Metro North and Long Island Railroad, store it and to use it. It's easy to describe. It's difficult to put into practice for instance, different models of subway cars, but that's the basic principle. And that's being explored in a serious way. And there are some regenerative mechanisms on subway cars, but it's being pursued in a serious way. Subways, Metro North, and Long Island Railroad, and has great promise.
That's great. I mean, regenerative brakes, that's what started the hybrid cars, and so it's great to see that technology moving. It's even used in elevators today across New York City as well. So it's a common technology.
That's right.
I hadn't thought about it for subways and trains, but it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. This next question is from Dan. I'm heartened to hear that you're working on rolling out UV light systems to kill virus particles in the air. However, there are no documented cases of surface fomite transmission of SARS-CoV-2 yet. The MTA is shutting down the subway every night and spending large amounts of money on surface disinfection. What do you say to the argument that surface disinfection is hygiene theater, and will you consider suspending surface cleaning and moving those funds or efforts to more effective and aggressive rollout of UV systems and other efforts?
So the short answer to that question is no. The public health officials obviously are focused on the aerosol issue, as are we. But surface contamination, surface infection is a possibility and has occurred in some cases. So our answer is we're pursuing both. The disinfecting of the stations and the rolling stock and buses, et cetera, including accessorized vehicles, of course, is extraordinarily important. It minimizes health risks to customers and employees, and we're going to continue doing that and continue exploring aerosol solutions. The air exchange on a typical subway car is 2 to 3 times that of, for instance, what the CDC or the public health officials would require in a hospital setting. And we are working, as I mentioned, with the FAR UV, UVC, and other the antimicrobials and other approaches to deal with the aerosol issue. So the answer for us is to attack them both.
Great. This is a question regarding the congestion pricing you discussed earlier. What can activists do to speed up the timeline for this? What can you tell us about a plan to deploy it?
Well, so there's 2 pieces to congestion pricing. There's the part that the MTA is responsible for and controls, and I'll report on that first, and then I'll report on the bureaucratic process in Washington. So a very talented woman named Allison DiSereno, who I work with at the Port Authority, is responsible for congestion pricing. She and Danny DiCrescenzo, who's the director of the MTA Bridges and Tunnels, working together on congestion pricing. The part that we're responsible for, which is the design of the system, is on time and on budget. There will come a point later this year where we will have to put our pencils down and shut off our computers, because we will not be able to go forward further to finalize the design without federal approval. That's just the way the federal environmental laws work. And that is a result of the fact that, as I mentioned before, certain of the roads, certain of the streets in Manhattan that are part of the congestion pricing zone received federal funding years and in some cases decades ago, and as a result have been, quote, federalized, close quote. That gives the federal government, U.S. Department of Transportation specifically, a seat at the table. And as I mentioned, congestion pricing, central business district tolling, its formal name, was passed into law in April of 2019. We began the first meeting, Commissioner Polly Trottenberg and I and our colleagues at the US DOT in Washington 10 or 14 days later, and have had scores of meetings and calls both in Washington and in the regional office here in New York State, and have not been able, we've been unsuccessful in getting the US DOT to rule on which congestion pricing environmental approach they would like to see. As I mentioned, it's paradoxical and cynical that a congestion pricing, central business district pricing, which is a wholly massive environmental good, is being held up for a decision on which environmental process should be pursued. And the environmental advantages are obviously, John, evident to everybody watching today, which is funding mass transit, reducing congestion, improving air quality, et cetera.
Great. I have two questions here about system and infrastructure upgrades. The first one is from Sarah. Does the system still use parts and technology from the original 1930 systems, such as signals, as has been reported? Will those be upgraded anytime soon?
So that's a great question. So there is some of the signaling system is old. Two lines have been replaced with a system called communication-based train control. We're pursuing a more advanced communication-based train control for new lines. The lines that have been re-signaled are the L, which was that tunnel was just completed, but it was re-signaled some years ago. And the other is the 7, which is the train from Flushing to Grand Central and then going to Hudson Yards. The 7 was completed in June of 2019. On-time performance, pre-pandemic, continues to be the case post-pandemic, but on-time performance on the 7 went from the 60s, which is an abysmal number, to the 90s. And the number of rush hour trains in the morning and evening rush was increased by 12 to 15%. So the 7 is one of the most crowded lines. It's the subway line that I happened to take as a kid for the most part because I grew up in Jackson Heights. And the 7 is one of the most crowded and most used lines, and the communication-based train control and its success in on-time performance and in adding capacity has been really important to our customers who take that line. The new capital plan, which is on pause, provides funding for 6 additional lines, which would frankly, including the Lexington Avenue line, which would frankly revolutionize commutes. And as I mentioned, the capital plan is on pause as a result of the financial damage done by the pandemic and the uncertainty related to federal funding. But your questioner's point is exactly right. And if the capital plan can be taken off pause and executed on, it will have a dramatic positive effect on the commutes of every customer and every agency, subways, buses, Metro North, Long Island Railroad, across the agency.
Great. And that second question was specifically about the 7 line, which you just answered. So we're going to move on.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this next question is from Chris. It's my understanding that the MTA pumps a lot of water out of its subway tunnels. This movement of water can be the basis for ground source heat pumps. Has the MTA considered using ground source heat pumps to heat and cool its own buildings and offering access to this resource for buildings along its subway tunnels?
So, good question. I don't know the answer to that question. On an average day, we get hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. Obviously, we're a subway system, we're subterranean, and we're all familiar with the open, not open, but the grates for ventilation purposes that run along some subway lines. I don't know the answer to the question. I'll find out.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions here about the electric buses. From Pragma, what is the MTA's strategy on the effect of fleet electrification on MTA's electric charges, particularly the demand charges?
Well, look, first, we are hoping, again, that the capital plan will come off pause and we'll be able to pursue the order for 500 electric buses with a goal of electrifying the whole system by the next capital plan. In terms of demand charges, we have been working with, in terms of chargers, various vendors at our bus depots, and have also experimented or in the process of experimenting with, for instance, charging devices in streets, looking at that, charging devices at bus stops and the like. The electricity supply issue is an important logistical one and business one, and we're in the process of working with not only bus manufacturers, but also financial sources with financing sources which have got interesting proposals on how one might finance it. From a electricity cost point of view, we have the advantage of NYPA power, New York Power Authority power. We just renegotiated our cost of electricity down by a not insignificant amount, and we're very focused on both the financial considerations as well as the environmental considerations related to those issues.
Great. Also regarding buses, to what extent has the MTA looked at the carbon impact of the electricity consumed by rail transit?
Well, look, we've looked at the issue. Obviously, we spent a lot of money on traction power, moving the subways and Metro North and Long Island Railroad. We do everything we can to buy the most environmentally friendly energy that we can. But given the size of our consumption and the fact that we need reliable, traction power has to be available when the Metro North train leaves the Yonkers station or the Long Island Railroad train leaves Ronkonkoma. Same thing with respect to subways. So there are limitations, but we're very focused on both the financial and environmental considerations related to that.
Great. This is from Bianca. What is the plan for the reduction of diesel on the commuter rail?
So the Long Island Railroad is doing a procurement now. We're moving away from diesel locomotives in all cases where there are commercial and reliable options. That's true on Long Island Railroad, Metro North, and with respect to work trains in the subway system.
Great. This is from Sarah. How will MTA make traveling via subway more attractive to get back to pre-pandemic levels so that more people will use it again?
Good question. First, we're focused, as I mentioned, on the disinfecting. 70% of customers surveyed, as I mentioned, say that subways, stations, and cars have never been cleaner. That's one. We're going to continue to pursue the pilots that I described, antimicrobials, ultraviolet C, far UV, and the air exchange issue. And lastly, and I think our effort has been successful, and other transit systems around the world have that entered the pandemic and exited the pandemic before New York did and the United States did. The mask issue is really fundamental, and it is a low-tech solution, but it works. And the higher the penetration, the higher the mask compliance and the penetration of masks in any environment, including public transit, the less spread of the virus and the healthier everybody will be. It minimizes health risk. All public health officials agree. So we're laser focused on the mask issue. We're going to continue the mask force. We're going to continue messaging and communicating. We've also been working with business groups, large and small, and labor groups with respect to getting the message out. We've worked with partnerships in New York City. We've worked with the chambers of commerce in each of the 5 boroughs, Long Island, Westchester, and beyond, and the messaging and communication of what we're doing. And I obviously, given the effect of the pandemic in New York and the fact that for a long time New York was the epicenter of the pandemic, it's natural that some customers and residents are going to have concerns. That's natural. We are making a factual case that the subways are clean, they're disinfected. If you wear a mask and your co-commuters do, and our employees do, and my sense is employee mask wearing is universal, you will have, together with the MTA, done everything you can do and we can do to minimize public health risks to customers and employees alike.
Hey, Pat, maybe just a follow on to that. What do you see as the long-term impact to the MTA from COVID-19?
Well, John, I'm an optimist about New York. I'm an optimist about cities. Going back to Roman times, Mumbai, Milan, Rome, all big, New York in 1918, 19 have been struck by pandemics and have come back even bigger and better. I believe that will be the case with respect to New York as well. We believe ridership will increase after Labor Day. We're not going to get back to 5.5 million customers in September of this year, but ridership will continue to increase. And in the long term, I'm bullish on New York City and New York State. I'm bullish on the MTA. We've got a very severe short-term fiscal issue as a result of the decline in revenues, primarily to some extent exacerbated by the fact that we're spending more disinfecting cars, and we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to pursue these pilots. But I'm a intermediate term and long-term bull on New York City, New York State, and the MTA.
Great. We're going to end on one more question here, and thanks to everybody who submitted today. We had a ton coming in. This question is from Ed. Other than money, what do you see as the greatest challenge facing the MTA?
Look, as New York goes, so goes the MTA. So we are completely affected by the fiscal, social, mental health, environmental health of New York City region, and New York State. That's not only a financial point, but it's a ridership point. And we are both dependent on the health of New York City and New York State and affected, right? The MTA is the circulatory system of New York City and beyond, including the commuter rails. And we will play a vital part of the economic recovery and the job creation in this region. Beyond that, the pandemic's a national issue. It requires a national solution. And wise federal funders would realize that nearly 10% of the national GDP is generated in this region. and thwarting and stunting the growth of that, the pace and extent of that recovery and the job creation really makes no sense. And it's in the national interest to fund the MTA and to get us over this short-term fiscal tsunami that I described earlier.
Well, great. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you to the audience. Pat, I really want to thank you for the truly informative discussion today and for spending all the time you have with us at Urban Green. Thank you very much. And we really want to thank the women and men at the MTA for what you do every day for New York City to make our city what it is. So, Pat, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
So John, thanks. And I want to echo the last point. During the depths of the pandemic, when we were carrying first responders and essential employees, MTA employees were heroes, moving heroes. They continue to do that. And just like doctors and nurses and utility workers and pharmacy workers and firefighters and police officers, MTA employees throughout subways, buses, Metro North Long Island Railroad, bridges and tunnels did extraordinary work every day in the most challenging circumstances. And we all owe them a huge debt of gratitude. Thanks for having me, John.
Absolutely. Thanks. Well, today's program is a great example of the work that we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions that have the biggest impact. And we do that through 4 key activities. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. So if you're not a member of Urban Green, check us out to stay on top of these issues like you heard about today and so much more, and to join a truly amazing network of people committed to sustainability in New York City and beyond.